There are places in this world that exist beyond the boundaries of normal reality. Places where the walls between our minds and the external world grow thin and permeable, where our deepest fears take shape and walk among us like living nightmares. There are towns that should not exist, streets that lead nowhere, and fog that hides truths too terrible for the human mind to comprehend. In the annals of horror, few locations have captured the imagination and terror of millions quite like Silent Hill, a cursed town nestled somewhere in the northeastern United States, a place where reality bends and breaks, where guilt transforms into monsters, and where the past never truly dies. This is not just a story about a video game franchise or a collection of horror tales. This is the complete journey of how one fictional town became a mirror held up to humanity's darkest corners, reflecting back our sins, our traumas, and our inability to escape the consequences of our actions. This is the entire story of Silent Hill, a journey into psychological horror that changed everything we thought we knew about fear itself. The tale of Silent Hill begins not in the town itself, but in the creative minds of a Japanese development team at Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo in the late 1990s. The video game industry was undergoing a massive transformation during this period, moving from sprite-based graphics to fully three-dimensional environments, and horror games were finding new ways to terrify players using these technological advances. Resident Evil had already established itself as the king of survival horror, with its mansion full of zombies and puzzles creating a template that seemed unbeatable. But a small team of developers led by Keiichiro Toyama had a different vision entirely. They did not want to create just another game about shooting monsters or surviving zombie outbreaks. Instead, they wanted to craft something that would burrow deep into the player's psyche, something that would make people question their own sanity and confront the darkness within themselves. The original concept for Silent Hill drew inspiration from a wide variety of sources that went far beyond typical horror fare. The team studied the works of filmmaker David Lynch, particularly his television series Twin Peaks, which depicted a seemingly normal American town hiding unspeakable darkness beneath its surface. They examined the writings of horror authors like Stephen King and Dean Koontz, who understood that true terror comes not from monsters but from the human condition itself. They looked at psychological thrillers and art films that prioritized atmosphere and dread over cheap scares. The goal was to create something that felt distinctly Western in its aesthetic while maintaining a Japanese sensibility in its approach to psychological horror. The team wanted to explore themes of guilt, repression, and the ways that trauma shapes and distorts our perception of reality. The first game in the series was released in January 1999 for the original PlayStation console, and from the moment players guided protagonist Harry Mason into the fog-shrouded streets of Silent Hill searching for his missing daughter Cheryl, they knew they were experiencing something completely different. The game opened with Harry driving along a mountain road at night when a mysterious figure appears in his headlights, causing him to swerve and crash. When he regains consciousness, his 7-year-old daughter has vanished, and the town he finds himself in seems almost abandoned, blanketed in an impossible fog that limits visibility to just a few feet ahead. The atmosphere was immediately oppressive and disorienting, with the fog serving both as a technical limitation to hide the PlayStation's short draw distance and as a brilliant artistic choice that made every corner potentially hide something terrible. Silent Hill the town was introduced as a tourist destination, a lakeside resort community with a troubled history that predated American colonization. The game revealed through documents and environmental storytelling that the area had been sacred ground for Native American tribes, who performed rituals there and believed the land held special power. When European settlers arrived, they brought their own beliefs and eventually established a religious community that would become increasingly cult-like in its practices. This cult, which worshipped a deity they believed would bring about a paradise on earth, performed dark rituals and sacrifices throughout Silent Hill's history, staining the town with blood and suffering that never truly washed away. The town itself seemed to remember every terrible thing that had happened within its boundaries, absorbing the pain and fear like a sponge until it became something more than just a geographic location. What made Silent Hill truly revolutionary was how the town responded to the people who entered it. Unlike other horror game settings that remained static regardless of who explored them, Silent Hill appeared to transform based on the psychological state of each visitor, manifesting their personal demons and forcing them to confront their deepest guilt and trauma. For protagonist Harry Mason, a widowed father desperate to find his daughter, the town became a twisted reflection of his fears about inadequacy and loss. The monsters he encountered were not random creatures but manifestations born from the collective unconscious of Silent Hill combined with the specific anxieties of those present. These creatures were disturbing not because they were traditionally scary but because they were deeply wrong, twisted mockeries of familiar forms that triggered primal discomfort. The game introduced players to the concept of the Otherworld, a nightmarish alternate dimension that would become one of Silent Hill's most iconic elements. Without warning, the foggy but relatively normal-looking town would transform, with reality peeling away like old paint to reveal a rusted, blood-stained industrial hellscape underneath. In these Otherworld sequences, the streets would be covered in metal grating, walls would be made of chain-link fence and corroded metal, blood would flow along surfaces, and the monsters would become even more aggressive and numerous. The transitions between the normal fog world and the Otherworld happened suddenly, often signaled by air raid sirens that would make players' hearts race with dread. This shifting reality became a signature of the series, representing how trauma and guilt can suddenly overwhelm us, transforming our perception of the world into something nightmarish. The first game's story revolved around Harry's desperate search for Cheryl, which led him to discover the town's dark history and the cult that still operated within its boundaries. He learned that his daughter was not actually his biological child, but had been adopted under mysterious circumstances 7 years earlier, and that she was connected to the cult's plans to birth their deity into the world. The cult leader, a woman named Dahlia Gillespie, had been manipulating events to ensure that her own daughter Alessa would serve as the vessel for this god. Alessa had been terribly burned in a ritual years earlier but kept alive through supernatural means. Her soul split into 2 halves, with one half becoming the child Harry knew as Cheryl. The entire nightmare Harry experienced was the result of Alessa's immense psychic pain and power reshaping reality around her trauma. The success of the first Silent Hill game surprised even its creators, as players responded not just to the scares but to the deeper psychological themes and the ambiguity of the storytelling. Unlike most games of the era that spelled out every plot point clearly, Silent Hill left much open to interpretation, with multiple endings that could be achieved based on player actions and choices throughout the game. Some endings were tragic, some were bittersweet, and one was intentionally absurd, showing that the developers did not take themselves so seriously that they could not have fun with the format. This approach to narrative, where players had to piece together the story from environmental clues, documents, and cryptic dialogue, created intense discussions and theories within the gaming community that continued long after people had finished playing. The sequel, Silent Hill 2, released in September 2001 for PlayStation 2, took everything that worked about the original and refined it into what many consider not just the best entry in the series but one of the greatest horror games ever created. The game followed James Sunderland, a man who receives a letter from his wife Mary asking him to meet her in Silent Hill, at their special place. The twist that sets everything in motion is that Mary has been dead for 3 years, having succumbed to a terrible illness. James knows this is impossible, but desperate hope drives him to the town anyway, where he finds himself trapped in a nightmare that seems specifically designed to torment him. The monsters he encounters are overtly sexual and violent in disturbing ways, and he meets other people also drawn to Silent Hill for their own dark reasons, each experiencing their own personal hell. Silent Hill 2 explored themes of grief, guilt, and repressed memory with a sophistication rarely seen in any entertainment medium, let alone video games. As James explored the town, he encountered Pyramid Head, a monster that would become the most iconic figure associated with the franchise. A hulking executioner with a massive triangular helmet that hid its face completely, wielding enormous weapons and dragging them along the ground with terrible scraping sounds. Pyramid Head served as James's personal punisher, a manifestation of his guilt that pursued him relentlessly. The game also introduced Maria, a woman who looked remarkably similar to Mary but dressed provocatively and acted flirtatiously with James, representing his sexual frustration and darker desires during his wife's long illness. The true horror of Silent Hill 2 emerged gradually as players realized that James was not an innocent victim but rather someone with a terrible secret he had repressed. Through the game's masterful storytelling, it was eventually revealed that James had not simply lost Mary to illness but had killed her himself, smothering her with a pillow as she lay sick and suffering. unable to bear watching her deteriorate any longer but also unable to admit his own selfish desire to be free from the burden of caring for her. The letter from Mary did not exist in reality but was a manifestation of James's desperate wish for forgiveness and his inability to accept what he had done. Every monster, every encounter, every disturbing image in the town was connected to his guilt and his struggle between wanting punishment and wanting absolution. Following the critical acclaim of Silent Hill 2, Konami continued expanding the franchise with multiple entries that explored different aspects of the town and its effects on various characters. Silent Hill 3, released in 2003, served as a direct sequel to the first game, following Heather Mason, who was revealed to be Cheryl and Alessa reborn into a single person. Now 17 years old, Heather had been living a normal life with Harry under assumed names, trying to escape the cult's influence. The game opened with Heather in a shopping mall, immediately establishing that Silent Hill's influence could reach beyond the town's boundaries when properly motivated. The cult had not forgotten about her and sought to use her as a vessel once again to birth their god into the world. Silent Hill 3 was notable for its female protagonist at a time when such characters were still relatively rare in gaming, and for its unflinching depiction of body horror and religious imagery. The game's monsters were even more grotesque than previous entries, with creatures that appeared to be flayed, inside out, or composed of writhing parts that should not fit together. The otherworld sequences reached new heights of disturbing imagery, with rooms made of flesh and bone, walls that pulsed like living organs, and corridors that seemed to extend into impossible dimensions. Heather's journey took her back to Silent Hill itself, where she had to confront not only the cult but also the trauma of Alessa's memories that still resided within her, memories of torture and betrayal that were not truly hers but affected her nonetheless. The game explored themes of identity and inherited trauma, questioning what makes someone who they are when they carry the memories and pain of another person. Heather struggled with anger and darkness that seemed to come from nowhere, not understanding that these feelings were echoes of what Alessa had endured. Her relationship with her father Harry provided emotional weight to the story, as players who had completed the first game saw how the desperate father searching for his daughter had become a loving parent, trying to protect her from the horrors he knew existed. The game did not shy away from tragedy, and Harry's fate added to the sense that Silent Hill never truly released anyone from its grasp. That once the town touched your life, the mark remained forever. Silent Hill 4, The Room, released in 2004, took a bold departure from the established formula by setting most of the game in a small apartment rather than the town itself. The protagonist, Henry Townsend, found himself trapped in his own apartment, with the doors and windows sealed by some supernatural force and a mysterious hole appearing in his bathroom that served as a portal to other nightmare realms. The game explored themes of voyeurism and isolation, as Henry had been an observer of others' lives, watching his neighbors through his window, and now found himself both trapped and forced to enter spaces that revealed dark secrets. The connection to Silent Hill was eventually revealed through the game's antagonist, Walter Sullivan, a serial killer who had been raised in the apartment and believed he needed to perform ritual murders to be reborn into the care of his mother. As the original development team members moved on to other projects, the Silent Hill franchise began to change in ways that divided fans. Silent Hill Origins, released in 2007 for PlayStation Portable and later PlayStation 2, was developed by a Western studio, Climax Studios, and served as a prequel to the first game. The game followed Travis Grady, a truck driver who encountered the burning Gillespie house where young Alessa was being immolated in the ritual that started everything. By saving Alessa from the flames, Travis became connected to Silent Hill's nightmare, and the game explored his own dark past involving his institutionalized mother and traumatic childhood. While the game had solid gameplay and attempted to honor the series' traditions, some fans felt it made Silent Hill's mythology too explicit, removing some of the ambiguity that made the earlier games so effective. Silent Hill Homecoming, released in 2008 and developed by Double Helix Games, featured more action-oriented gameplay and followed soldier Alex Shepard returning to his hometown of Shepherd's Glen to search for his missing brother. The game revealed that Shepherd's Glen had been founded by 4 families who made a pact with Silent Hill's supernatural forces, agreeing to sacrifice one child from each family every generation to keep the darkness contained. When Alex's family failed to fulfill their pact, the consequences spread throughout the town. The game drew heavy inspiration from the Silent Hill film released in 2006, incorporating elements like the iconic nurses with their jerky, twitching movements. However, many fans criticized Homecoming for focusing too much on combat and not enough on atmosphere and psychological horror, feeling it had become too similar to other action games. Silent Hill: Shattered Memories, released in 2009 for Wii and later PlayStation 2 and PSP, represented something completely different and fascinating. Developed by Climax Studios, the game was a reimagining of the first Silent Hill rather than a direct remake, taking the basic premise of Harry Mason searching for his daughter but transforming it into something new. The game incorporated psychological profiling, with therapy sessions breaking up the gameplay segments where a psychiatrist asked players personal questions and analyzed their behavior. Based on how players responded and what they looked at or avoided during gameplay, the game would change character appearances, dialogue, and even which monsters appeared. The game removed combat entirely, creating pure psychological horror where players had to flee when the world froze over and nightmarish creatures pursued them. The experimental nature of Shattered Memories polarized fans, with some praising its innovative approach to personalized horror, while others missed the classic Silent Hill atmosphere. The game explored themes of memory and how we reconstruct the past to suit our needs, with the entire story ultimately revealed as a therapeutic exercise to help a young woman come to terms with her father's death in a car accident when she was a child. Everything players had experienced was a manifestation of Cheryl's attempts to remember her father, with Harry never truly existing as we knew him, but rather being an idealized version created by a daughter who lost him too young. This twist recontextualized everything and demonstrated how our memories and perceptions can create entire realities that are simultaneously true and false. Silent Hill: Downpour, released in 2012 and developed by Vatra Games, would be the last major entry in the mainline series for many years. The game followed Murphy Pendleton, a prisoner being transferred to another facility when the transport crashes near Silent Hill. Murphy was running from his own dark past involving the death of his son and his revenge against the man responsible, which led him to prison. The game featured a more open structure than previous entries, with side quests and optional exploration that some fans appreciated, while others felt it diluted the focused horror experience. Downpour attempted to return to the series' psychological roots, with monsters and scenarios reflecting Murphy's guilt and trauma, but technical issues and uneven quality held it back from reaching the heights of earlier entries. During this period, Konami also attempted to bring Silent Hill to other media with varying degrees of success. The 2006 film adaptation, directed by Christoph Gans, was one of the better video game film adaptations, capturing the atmosphere and visual style of the games while telling a story that combined elements from multiple entries in the series. The film followed Rose da Silva searching for her adopted daughter Sharon in Silent Hill, uncovering the town's dark past involving the immolation of a young girl named Alessa by religious fanatics. The film's depiction of the otherworld transition, with everything peeling away and transforming accompanied by the wailing of air raid sirens, was particularly effective and iconic. However, the film simplified some of the game's more complex themes and added new mythological elements that did not always fit. A sequel film, Silent Hill: Revelation, released in 2012, adapted elements of Silent Hill 3 but suffered from a lower budget and less focused direction, resulting in a film that satisfied neither critics nor fans. The movie attempted to continue the story of Sharon, now calling herself Heather, as she dealt with the cult's continued interest in her. But the execution felt rushed and hollow compared to the first film's atmosphere. These film adaptations highlighted the difficulty of translating Silent Hill's interactive horror to passive media, as so much of what made the games effective was the player's direct participation in the nightmare and the way the experience could be tailored to individual psychology. Perhaps most tragically, the franchise came close to a potential renaissance in 2014 with a project that would have brought series creator Keiichiro Toyama, filmmaker Guillermo del Toro, and legendary game designer Hideo Kojima together to create Silent Hills. The project was announced through PT, a playable teaser released on PlayStation 4 that presented itself as a mysterious horror demo from an unknown developer. Players explored a single hallway that looped impossibly on itself, with subtle changes occurring each time they walked through. building dread and confusion until a terrifying encounter with a ghost known as Lisa. The demo was a masterpiece of psychological horror that had millions of players terrified to continue but unable to stop, and the revelation that it was teasing a new Silent Hill game directed by Kojima and featuring actor Norman Reedus created immense excitement. However, Konami's relationship with Hideo Kojima deteriorated during this period, leading to Kojima's departure from the company and the cancellation of Silent Hills. The company even went so far as to remove PT from the PlayStation Store, making it impossible for new players to experience it and turning PlayStation 4 consoles with the demo still installed into valuable collector's items. This cancellation represented a devastating blow to fans who had been hoping for a return to the series' psychological horror roots under the guidance of creative visionaries who understood what made Silent Hill special. The cancellation symbolized how Konami seemed to have lost interest in creating new games in the franchise, focusing instead on mobile games and other ventures that were more immediately profitable. In the years following the Silent Hill's cancellation, Silent Hill as a franchise entered a period of silence that seemed almost fitting for a series about towns that exist outside normal reality. Konami released no new mainline games, only occasionally licensing the property for things like pachinko machines in Japan or asymmetrical multiplayer games that failed to capture what fans loved about the series. Dead by Daylight, a popular asymmetrical horror game, added content from Silent Hill in 2020, bringing Pyramid Head, Cheryl Mason, and the Midwich Elementary School map into that game and introducing a new generation to these characters. But this was not the same as a proper new entry in the series. The absence of new Silent Hill games during this period led to an interesting phenomenon where the franchise's influence seemed to grow even stronger. Independent developers who had been inspired by Silent Hill began creating their own horror games that carried forward its legacy. Games like Layers of Fear, The Medium, and Visage drew heavily from Silent Hill's approach to psychological horror, focusing on atmosphere, environmental storytelling, and the way guilt and trauma can reshape reality. These spiritual successors kept the flame alive and demonstrated that there was still a substantial audience craving the kind of horror that Silent Hill pioneered. The series had become so influential that its absence was felt throughout the entire horror gaming landscape. Silent Hill's impact extended far beyond just horror games, influencing how games approached storytelling and atmosphere in general. The series demonstrated that games could tackle complex psychological themes and treat players like intelligent adults capable of interpreting ambiguous narratives. The way Silent Hill used game mechanics themselves to enhance horror, such as the static-filled radio that warned of nearby monsters, or the way limited visibility forced players into constant anxiety, influenced countless other titles. The series proved that less could be more, that suggestion and implication were often more frightening than explicit gore, and that the most effective horror came from making players complicit in the nightmare rather than just witnesses to it. Throughout the years of silence, the Silent Hill fan community remained remarkably dedicated and active. Fans created extensive websites cataloging every detail of the series' complex mythology, creating timelines and theories that attempted to connect all the games into a coherent whole despite contradictions and ambiguities. Some fans argued that trying to create a unified canon missed the point, that each game represented a different person's psychological experience with the town and therefore did not need to fit together perfectly. Online forums hosted endless debates about the meaning of various symbols, the true nature of the town's power, and which interpretation of various plot points was most valid. This active theorizing and discussion kept the series alive in the minds of horror fans. Fan artists and writers created their own stories set in Silent Hill, exploring how the town might interact with different types of people and traumas. Some fans created elaborate analyses of the game's symbolism, examining how creatures like Pyramid Head represented not just individual guilt but broader concepts of punishment and sadomasochism, or how the nurses that appeared across multiple games reflected anxieties about illness, sexuality, and care. The depth of symbolism in the series provided endless material for interpretation, with some readings focusing on psychological themes, others on religious symbolism, and still others on social commentary about topics like abuse, mental illness, and the way society fails vulnerable people. Musicians and composers studied Akira Yamaoka's soundtrack work for the series, which had been integral to creating Silent Hill's unsettling atmosphere. Yamaoka's compositions combined industrial noise, ambient soundscapes, and surprisingly beautiful melancholic melodies to create audio that was simultaneously disturbing and emotionally affecting. Songs like Theme of Laura from Silent Hill 2 became beloved pieces of game music that could stand on their own, while the harsh industrial sounds that accompanied otherworld sequences became instantly recognizable. Yamaoka's work demonstrated how sound design in horror could be just as important as visual design, with audio cues creating dread and discomfort that enhanced every other element. Speedrunners found ways to complete the games in record times, discovering glitches and shortcuts that broke the games in fascinating ways, while also demonstrating deep knowledge of every aspect of the titles. These speedruns became popular viewing, as people enjoyed seeing games they found terrifying reduced to precise sequences of inputs and optimal routes. At the same time, other players created challenge runs, attempting to complete games without taking damage or without using certain items, pushing the boundaries of what was possible within these horror experiences. This variety of ways to engage with the games showed their lasting appeal and the depth of their design. In 2022, after years of silence and fan disappointment, rumors began circulating that Konami was finally ready to bring Silent Hill back in a meaningful way. These rumors persisted for months, with various leaks and hints suggesting that multiple projects were in development, including remakes of classic games and entirely new entries. Fans who had been burned by the Silent Hill's cancellation were cautiously optimistic but afraid to hope too much after so many years of disappointment. The speculation reached a fever pitch until Konami finally confirmed the rumors with an official announcement transmission in October 2022, revealing not just one but several Silent Hill projects in various stages of development. The announcement revealed that Bloober Team, the Polish studio behind psychological horror games like Layers of Fear and The Medium, was developing a full remake of Silent Hill 2, completely rebuilding the classic game from the ground up for modern hardware. This news generated mixed reactions, as while Bloober Team had demonstrated competence with atmospheric horror, some fans worried whether they could capture the subtle psychological depth that made the original so effective. The announcement also revealed Silent Hill Townfall being developed by No Code, the studio behind Observation, and Silent Hill F being developed by Neobards Entertainment, a new game set in 1960s Japan, showing that Konami was willing to take the franchise in new directions and settings while also honoring its past. Perhaps most intriguingly, the announcement included Return to Silent Hill, a new film directed by Christoph Gans, who had directed the first movie adaptation. Gans promised a more faithful adaptation that would capture the essence of Silent Hill 2's story and themes. Additionally, Konami revealed Ascension, an interactive streaming series where viewers would collectively make choices that determined the story's direction. This multi-pronged approach suggested that Konami had finally recognized the value of the Silent Hill property and was investing serious resources into reviving it across multiple media. For fans who had waited nearly a decade for any significant Silent Hill content, this sudden abundance of projects felt almost surreal. The announcement of these projects sparked renewed discussion about what made Silent Hill special and what fans hoped to see in new entries. Many emphasized the importance of psychological depth over simple scares, the need for ambiguous storytelling that respected player intelligence, and the crucial role of atmosphere and sound design in creating effective horror. Fans debated whether new games should continue exploring the town of Silent Hill itself, or whether the series should expand to show how similar supernatural manifestations of guilt and trauma might occur in other locations. Some argued that Silent Hill was about a specific place with specific history, while others contended that the series had always been more about psychological states than geographic locations. What truly set Silent Hill apart from other horror franchises was its commitment to exploring genuine psychological concepts rather than simply using psychology as window dressing for traditional monster horror. The series drew from various schools of psychological thought, incorporating ideas about repression, projection, the shadow self, and how unresolved trauma could manifest in distorted perceptions of reality. The town itself functioned almost like a Jungian unconscious, a collective repository of human darkness and suffering that could tap into individual psyches and externalize internal struggles. This grounding in real psychological concepts gave the horror weight and resonance that pure fantasy monsters could never achieve. Silent Hill explored how guilt could consume a person from within, transforming their entire perception of the world. Characters throughout the series were not innocent victims randomly attacked by evil forces, but rather people carrying terrible secrets, past actions that haunted them, or traumas that had never been properly processed. The horror they experienced was intrinsically tied to their psychological state, meaning that the nightmare was in some sense self-inflicted, a manifestation of their inability to face truth about themselves. This made the horror deeply personal and relatable, as everyone carries some degree of guilt or trauma, and the series suggested that we all create our own private hells through our refusal to confront our darker aspects. The series also examined how perception shapes reality and how unreliable our own minds can be. Multiple games featured protagonists who were revealed to be unreliable narrators, their recollections of events colored by wishful thinking, denial, or self-justification. This narrative approach forced players to question everything they had been told and seen, to piece together actual truth from fragments scattered throughout the experience. The use of multiple endings reinforced this theme, as different outcomes suggested different interpretations of the same events, none definitively more real than the others. This postmodern approach to narrative was unusual in games and contributed to Silent Hill's reputation for sophisticated storytelling. The monsters in Silent Hill served as externalized symbols of internal psychological states rather than existing as creatures with their own ecology or logic. Pyramid Head represented punishment and sadomasochistic guilt, the manifestation of a desire for suffering as atonement. The nurses represented sexualized anxiety about illness and the corruption of caregiving into something threatening. The abstract daddy from Silent Hill 2 represented childhood sexual abuse, its form suggesting a figure on a bed and mattress fused into a single horrifying entity. These symbolic monsters made the horror more disturbing because they tapped into real psychological wounds rather than simply being scary for their own sake. Understanding what the monsters represented added a layer of tragedy to the horror, as players realized they were literally fighting externalized trauma. Silent Hill's mastery of atmosphere separated it from virtually all other horror games. From the first moments of the original game, when Harry walked into the fog and found the town apparently deserted, every element worked together to create pervasive unease. The fog itself became an iconic element, limiting visibility and making every corner potentially dangerous while also creating a dreamlike quality that made the experience feel unmoored from normal reality. The fog was not just a technical limitation but a narrative element that suggested the town existed in a space between worlds, neither fully real nor entirely imaginary. Players would strain to see shapes moving in the distance, never quite certain if something was there or if their minds were playing tricks on them. The sound design deserves enormous credit for Silent Hill's effectiveness at creating dread. Akira Yamaoka's work combined industrial noise, ambient soundscapes, and distant, distorted audio that suggested things happening just out of sight. The static from Harry's radio that warned of nearby monsters became a source of anxiety in itself, as players would hear the crackling begin and no danger was approaching but not from which direction. Footsteps echoed in empty streets, chains rattled in the darkness, and unidentifiable sounds created constant tension. The music shifted seamlessly from haunting melodies to harsh noise, supporting the emotional tone of each moment. In many horror games, silence is frightening, but in Silent Hill, the sounds themselves became sources of terror. The visual design of both the Fog World and Otherworld created distinct types of horror. The Fog World was unsettling because it appeared almost normal but felt fundamentally wrong, with the absence of people and the oppressive atmosphere creating the sense of being trapped in a dying place. The Otherworld, with its industrial decay, rust, blood, and impossible geometry, represented nightmare made manifest, a place where the physical laws of reality were suspended and everything existed to create suffering. The transitions between these states, marked by sirens and the literal peeling away of reality, became some of the most frightening moments in gaming, as players knew that the already dangerous Fog World was about to become exponentially worse. The games also used lighting expertly to create fear and disorientation. Dark spaces that the player's flashlight could barely penetrate, flickering lights that suggested movement, and the stark shadows of the Otherworld all contributed to the sense that safety was an illusion. Unlike action games where light meant safety and darkness meant danger, Silent Hill made even well-lit areas feel threatening, because the horror was not about what was hiding in darkness, but about the fundamental wrongness of the space itself. The games proved that horror did not require darkness to be effective. that bright light could illuminate disturbing truths that darkness mercifully concealed. Beneath the supernatural horror and psychological symbolism, Silent Hill games told fundamentally human stories about loss, grief, guilt, and the struggle to accept painful truths. Harry Mason's desperate search for his daughter in the first game resonated because every parent can imagine the terror of losing a child and the lengths they would go to find them. The twist that Cheryl was not truly his biological daughter did not diminish his love or make his quest less valid, showing that families are defined by bonds rather than blood. His willingness to face impossible horrors for his daughter made him a sympathetic protagonist whose determination players could admire even as his situation became increasingly nightmarish. James Sunderland's story in Silent Hill 2 remains perhaps the most emotionally complex in the series because of how it forced players to confront uncomfortable truths about mercy, euthanasia, and the selfish aspects of caregiving. James loved his wife Mary, but he also grew to resent the burden of caring for her as her illness progressed and she became bitter and cruel in her suffering. His decision to end her life came from a mix of mercy and selfish desire to be free, and his repression of this act and the guilt it generated created the entire nightmare. The game did not present easy answers about whether his action was justified or if forgiveness was possible, instead leaving players to grapple with moral ambiguity. This refusal to provide clear moral judgment made the story more powerful and thought-provoking. Heather Mason's journey in Silent Hill 3 explored identity and the question of how much we are defined by memories and experiences that are not truly ours. As the reincarnation of Alessa and Harry's adopted daughter Cheryl, Heather carried trauma and anger that she did not understand because they originated from Alessa's tortured past. Her struggle to maintain her own identity while acknowledging this dark heritage reflected real questions about nature versus nurture and whether we can escape the circumstances of our origin. The game also examined grief through Heather's loss of her father, showing how tragedy can push people toward darkness or toward finding strength they did not know they possessed. Throughout the series, supporting characters added depth and raised questions about the nature of Silent Hill's influence. Characters like Angela Orozco in Silent Hill 2, a young woman fleeing from abuse who saw Silent Hill as burning flames rather than rust and decay, suggested that the town manifested differently for each person based on their specific trauma. Her encounter with Abstract Daddy and her eventual surrender to her personal hell was heartbreaking and showed that not everyone could overcome their demons. Eddie Dombrowski, another character in Silent Hill 2, demonstrated how victimization could transform into violent rage, and his descent into becoming a killer himself showed the complex relationship between suffering and perpetrating harm. These supporting characters were not merely obstacles but fully realized people with their own tragic stories. Silent Hill's influence spread far beyond video games to affect horror as a cultural phenomenon. The imagery from the series became iconic, with Pyramid Head in particular becoming one of the most recognizable horror characters across all media. The creature appeared in the films, in cameos in other games, in fan art and cosplay, and became shorthand for existential guilt and punishment. The rusted, decaying industrial aesthetic of the Otherworld influenced countless other horror works, from films to television shows to other games, becoming almost a visual language for psychological horror. When creators wanted to depict the physical manifestation of trauma or mental breakdown, they drew from Silent Hill's vocabulary of rust, decay, and impossible spaces. The series influenced how horror stories in general approached psychological themes and ambiguous narratives. Before Silent Hill, most horror in popular media was relatively straightforward, with clear monsters and victims, good and evil, and definitive endings. Silent Hill popularized the idea of horror that was interpretive, where audiences needed to actively engage with symbolism and subtext to understand what was happening. This approach has become more common across horror media, with films, novels, and games increasingly willing to leave questions unanswered and trust audiences to grapple with ambiguity. The series showed that horror fans were capable of and hungry for complex, thoughtful narratives that treated them as intelligent interpreters rather than passive consumers. Academic study of horror games frequently uses Silent Hill as a primary example when discussing how games can achieve artistic significance and emotional depth. Scholars have written extensively about the series' use of psychological symbolism, its narrative techniques, its approach to player agency, and its commentary on topics ranging from gender to religion to mental illness. The series has been analyzed through various critical lenses including psychoanalytic theory, feminist criticism, and postmodern philosophy. This academic attention elevated video games as a medium, demonstrating that games could be as worthy of serious analysis as literature or film. Silent Hill became evidence that games were not merely entertainment but could be genuine art. The community that formed around Silent Hill demonstrated how horror can bring people together through shared experience of fear and fascination. Fans created extensive fan works, from artwork depicting the characters and monsters to fiction exploring untold stories within the universe to elaborate theories attempting to decode every symbol and reference. Some fans created physical props and replicas from the games, building their own pyramid head costumes or crafting the great knife weapon. Others composed music inspired by Akira Yamaoka's soundtracks or created video essays analyzing every aspect of the games. This creative community response showed that great horror inspires not just fear but genuine passion and engagement. Silent Hill consistently explored themes that most entertainment avoided or treated superficially, giving the series a depth that rewarded repeated analysis. The examination of guilt went beyond simple wrong actions to explore how people justify their behavior to themselves and construct narratives that allow them to avoid accountability. Characters in Silent Hill were masters of self-deception, and the town stripped away those comfortable lies to force confrontation with actual truth. This made the horror more uncomfortable because players had to watch characters realize terrible things about themselves, and by extension, players might recognize their own capacity for self-deception and moral failure. The series frequently examined the relationship between love and possession, showing how care can become controlling and how protection can become imprisonment. Multiple games featured parental figures whose love for their children became twisted into something harmful, whether through the cult parents willing to sacrifice their children for religious belief or through overprotective parents who could not let their children develop independence. The games suggested that love without respect for the beloved's autonomy was ultimately a form of selfishness, and that the most harmful actions are often justified through claims of caring. This theme resonated because it touched on real dynamics in troubled families. Religion and faith received particularly complex treatment throughout the series, with the cult worshipping a deity that promised paradise but demanded horrific sacrifices. The series did not simply present religion as evil but rather explored how spiritual belief could be corrupted, how certainty could lead to fanaticism, and how the promise of transcendence could be used to justify atrocity. The cult members were not cartoon villains but believers convinced they were serving a higher purpose, making them more unsettling because their motivations were comprehensible. The games asked difficult questions about the relationship between faith and reason, between spiritual experience and delusion, without providing easy answers. The nature of reality itself was a constant theme, with the games questioning whether the supernatural events were objectively real or manifestations of disturbed psychology. This ambiguity was intentional and important, as definitive answers would have diminished the horror. If everything was purely psychological, the supernatural dread would be lost, but if everything was purely supernatural, the personal responsibility and psychological depth would be lessened. By refusing to settle the question, the series maintained both types of horror simultaneously, creating a space where internal and external terrors were inextricably linked. This ambiguity reflected real questions about the nature of perception and whether truly objective reality is even accessible to us. The technical progression of the Silent Hill series across console generations demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of game technology in creating horror. The original PlayStation game made brilliant use of that system's limitations, turning the inability to render distant objects into the iconic fog, and using fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds to create cinematic framing. The controls were deliberately somewhat clunky, making players feel vulnerable and contributing to the sense that protagonists were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances rather than trained fighters. These technical limitations actually enhanced the horror by creating frustration and helplessness that made the experience more frightening. The move to PlayStation 2 for Silent Hill 2 and 3 allowed for real-time 3D environments with dynamic lighting and more detailed character models and textures. This enabled more elaborate otherworld designs with moving parts and environmental effects that would have been impossible on the original PlayStation. The improved audio capabilities meant more complex sound design with better spatial positioning and higher quality music. However, The move to more powerful hardware also meant that developers had to work harder to maintain the same level of atmospheric dread, as increased visual clarity could potentially make the games less scary by revealing too much. The best entries maintained the balance between showing enough to be disturbing and leaving enough to imagination. Later entries on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 pushed the visual fidelity even further, with more detailed textures, complex lighting effects, and larger, more open environments. However, some fans felt that these technical improvements actually worked against the series' strengths, as the increased realism made the symbolism less effective, and the focus on graphics sometimes came at the expense of atmosphere. The move toward more action-oriented gameplay in some entries seemed to stem from the capabilities of the hardware and the expectations of what high-definition console games should be, rather than from what would best serve Silent Hill's particular brand of horror. This tension between technical progress and artistic vision affected many franchises but was particularly noticeable in horror games. The various ports and remasters of Silent Hill games became controversial among fans due to changes from the original versions. The Silent Hill HD Collection, released in 2012, featured updated graphics for Silent Hill 2 and 3 but also included changed voice acting, altered fog effects, and numerous bugs that detracted from the experience. Fans who had played the original versions were often disappointed by these changes, feeling that the remasters had lost some of the original atmosphere and carefully crafted details. This situation highlighted how remastering classic games is more complicated than simply updating graphics, particularly for horror games where every element contributes to the overall effect and even small changes can significantly alter the experience. Akira Yamaoka's contribution to Silent Hill cannot be overstated, as his musical and sound design work was as essential to the series' identity as the visual design or writing. Yamaoka created a sonic palette that was instantly recognizable, combining industrial noise and ambient soundscapes with surprising moments of melodic beauty. His work understood that horror audio should not be constant intensity but rather should ebb and flow, with quiet moments that allow tension to build before sudden loud or harsh sounds create shock. The music often felt emotionally opposed to what was happening on screen, with gentle melodies playing during disturbing sequences, creating cognitive dissonance that enhanced the unsettling atmosphere. The sound design in Silent Hill went beyond music to create a complete auditory environment that was as important as the visual environment. The radio static that warned of monsters became one of gaming's most effective audio cues, with players learning to dread that crackling sound even though it was actually warning them and giving them time to prepare. Environmental sounds like footsteps on different surfaces, the creaking of doors, the dripping of water, and the ambient industrial noise of the otherworld all contributed to making the spaces feel real and present. The games understood that silence could be as frightening as noise when used correctly, with quiet moments allowing players' imaginations to fill the void with anticipated horrors. Yamaoka's melodic compositions often featured vocals by Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, whose haunting voice became strongly associated with the series. Songs like Theme of Laura, You're Not Here, and Room of Angel combined emotional lyrics about loss, guilt, and longing with beautiful melodies that could stand alone as complete musical pieces outside the games. These songs played during ending credits or key emotional moments, giving voice to the unexpressed feelings of the characters and allowing players to process the emotional journey they had experienced. The contrast between these delicate, melancholic songs and the harsh industrial sounds of gameplay created a range that kept the audio experience engaging throughout. The influence of Yamaoka's Silent Hill work can be heard in horror game soundtracks that followed, with many composers adopting similar techniques of combining ambient noise, industrial sounds, and melodic elements. His willingness to use unconventional sounds and to prioritize atmosphere over traditional musical structure opened up possibilities for game audio that extended beyond horror to affect how games approach sound design generally. When Yamaoka left Konami after Silent Hill Downpour, fans worried that future entries would lose a crucial element of what made the series special, and indeed the absence of his distinctive audio style in later projects was noticeably felt. The dense symbolic language of Silent Hill games provided endless material for interpretation and analysis. The series drew from a wide range of symbolic traditions including Christian imagery, Jungian psychology, occult traditions, and Japanese horror conventions, weaving these together into a complex tapestry that could be read on multiple levels. For some players, the games were simply about fighting monsters and solving puzzles. But for those willing to engage more deeply, every creature, every room, every object could be analyzed for symbolic meaning. This depth of symbolism elevated the games from entertainment to something approaching art, as they rewarded careful attention and thoughtful interpretation. The use of rust and decay in the otherworld has been interpreted as representing the corrosion of innocence and memory, the inevitable deterioration of all things, and the ugliness that lies beneath society's clean surfaces. The blood and flesh that cover surfaces in the otherworld suggest trauma made visible, the body turned inside out, and the intrusion of the organic into the mechanical. The chain-link fences and grating that appear everywhere could represent barriers and imprisonment, or the permeable boundary between reality and nightmare. The games never explicitly explain these symbols, allowing players to construct their own interpretations based on the context of each specific story and character. Monster designs were particularly rich with symbolic meaning, with most creatures representing specific traumas or psychological states. The lying figure monsters from Silent Hill 2, with their forms wrapped in flesh and straitjacket-like skin, have been interpreted as representing James's desire to hide truth and his feeling of being trapped by circumstances. The mannequin creatures that appeared in multiple games suggested sexual objectification and the reduction of people to parts. The childlike monsters in Silent Hill 3 reflected Heather's fear of motherhood and birth being forced upon her. By designing monsters as symbolic representations rather than as biologically logical creatures, the games created horror that was more psychologically disturbing than traditional monster horror could achieve. The use of color and lighting also carried symbolic weight, with the rusted red-brown of the otherworld contrasting with the gray-white fog world and the occasional appearance of other colors signaling important moments or themes. Water appeared frequently across the series as a symbol of the unconscious, rebirth, and the boundary between life and death, with many key locations being near or surrounded by water. Mirrors appeared as symbols of self-reflection and the inability to escape one's own image and truth. These recurring visual symbols created a consistent language across the series that fans learned to read, making each new game's use of these symbols meaningful within the context of the larger franchise. Silent Hill engaged with philosophical questions about the nature of evil, suffering, and moral responsibility in ways that most horror avoided. The series rejected the simple concept of external evil in favor of exploring how ordinary people create their own nightmares through their choices and the psychological mechanisms they use to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. This approach aligned with existentialist philosophy, which emphasizes individual responsibility and the human tendency towards self-deception and bad faith. The town of Silent Hill served as a kind of existential judgment that stripped away pretense and forced characters to face what they actually were rather than what they pretended to be. The series also explored the problem of suffering and whether it serves any redemptive purpose. Characters in Silent Hill suffered intensely, both physically and psychologically, but the games questioned whether this suffering led to growth and redemption or simply broke people further. Some characters like James Sunderland could potentially find some form of peace depending on player choices, while others like Angela Orozco appeared beyond saving, with their suffering having no purpose except more suffering. This realistic portrayal of trauma acknowledged that not all pain leads to positive growth and that some wounds cannot be healed, a darker and more honest approach than the redemptive suffering often portrayed in other media. The nature of reality and perception was a constant philosophical concern, with the games suggesting that objective reality might be less stable and definite than we assume. If Silent Hill manifests differently for each person based on their psychology, then in what sense can it be said to have an objective existence? Are the other people characters encounter actually real or projections of their own mind? The games deliberately left these questions unresolved, embracing a kind of philosophical uncertainty that reflected postmodern skepticism about grand narratives and absolute truth. This philosophical ambiguity made the games more intellectually engaging and encouraged players to think deeply about epistemological questions. The series also examined questions of justice and punishment, with Pyramid Head serving as perhaps the most prominent symbol of this theme. As a manifestation of James's desire for punishment, Pyramid Head raised questions about whether guilt requires punishment to be resolved, whether self-punishment serves any constructive purpose, and who has the right to judge and condemn. The games suggested that while accountability is necessary, self-flagellation and excessive guilt can become obstacles to genuine redemption. This nuanced approach to guilt and punishment reflected sophisticated moral thinking that recognized the complexity of these issues rather than reducing them to simple formulas. The multiple endings featured in Silent Hill games represented a sophisticated approach to player agency and narrative meaning. Unlike games where different endings were simply rewards for completing certain challenges, Silent Hill's endings reflected different interpretations of the story and different outcomes based on the player's choices and playstyle. Some endings were tragic, some offered hope, some were darkly comic, and some completely recontextualized everything that came before. This approach acknowledged that stories, particularly psychological stories, do not have single definitive interpretations but rather can be understood in multiple valid ways. In Silent Hill 2, the different endings for James ranged from him potentially finding peace after accepting his guilt, to him committing suicide unable to live with what he had done, to him leaving Silent Hill with Maria as a replacement for Mary, doomed to repeat his patterns, to the infamous joke endings that broke the fourth wall completely. The game determined which ending players received based on subtle factors like how much health they maintained, how often they examined certain items, and whether they listened to specific audio messages. This meant players shaped the outcome through behavior rather than explicit binary choices, making the endings feel more organic and meaningful. The choice to include joke endings alongside serious ones was controversial, but ultimately reinforced the game's themes about interpretation and subjective reality. The UFO endings and the dog ending in Silent Hill 2 were completely absurd, revealing that everything had been controlled by aliens or a dog, respectively. While these broke the horror atmosphere, they also reminded players that they were engaging with a constructed narrative and that meaning is something we impose rather than something that exists objectively. These joke endings also provided relief after the intense psychological horror of the serious endings, giving players permission to laugh after being deeply disturbed. Later games experimented with different approaches to endings and player choice, with some making choices more explicit and others continuing the subtle approach of the early games. The challenge was always to make choices feel meaningful without making the game feel like it was simply testing whether players chose option A or B. The most effective endings felt like natural consequences of how players had approached the entire experience rather than results of a single decision at the end. This approach to branching narratives influenced how many other games thought about player choice and consequence. As Silent Hill prepares to return through the various announced projects, questions remain about whether new entries can capture what made the series special while also evolving to remain relevant to contemporary audiences. The horror landscape has changed significantly since the series' heyday, with psychological horror becoming more mainstream and audiences more sophisticated in their understanding of the genre's tropes and techniques. New Silent Hill games will need to find ways to surprise and disturb players who have been influenced by the original games and the many works those games inspired. This is a significant challenge, as the power of the early games came partly from how unexpected their approach was. The Silent Hill 2 remake by Bloober Team faces particularly high expectations, as it is remaking one of the most beloved and critically acclaimed horror games ever created. Fans want the remake to preserve what made the original special while updating visuals and potentially gameplay to meet modern standards. However, even small changes to a game as carefully crafted as Silent Hill 2 could significantly alter its effect, and the remake will inevitably be compared unfavorably to people's memories of the original. The challenge for Bloober Team is to honor the source material while also justifying the remake's existence by offering something new rather than simply being a visual upgrade. The new original entries like Silent Hill F and Townfall have the advantage of not being directly compared to beloved classics but face the challenge of proving they understand what makes Silent Hill distinctive. The decision to set Silent Hill F in 1960s Japan is interesting because it moves away from the American small-town setting that has defined the series, while potentially exploring how Silent Hill's themes of guilt and trauma might manifest in a completely different cultural context. Whether the core concepts of Silent Hill can successfully translate to different settings and cultures remains to be seen, but the attempt shows willingness to take creative risks. Regardless of how the new projects turn out, Silent Hill's legacy is secure. The series fundamentally changed what horror games could be, demonstrating that games were capable of sophisticated psychological horror that could compete with the best examples in any medium. The original games remain powerful experiences even decades after release, their themes and atmosphere continuing to affect new players who discover them. The influence on the horror genre broadly and gaming specifically ensures that Silent Hill will be remembered and studied long into the future. Whether or not the town ever receives a worthy new visit, it has already earned its place in the pantheon of great horror. Silent Hill represents something more than just a successful horror franchise or a series of acclaimed video games. It stands as a mirror held up to the human psyche, reflecting back the darkness that dwells within all of us, the guilt we carry, the traumas we repress, and the lies we tell ourselves to make existence bearable. The town that should not exist, wrapped in its impossible fog and capable of transforming into rusted nightmare at the wail of a siren, became a metaphor for the human mind itself, with its capacity to distort reality, to manifest internal suffering as external horror, and to trap us in cycles of punishment and guilt that serve no purpose but continue nonetheless. The journey through Silent Hill's history from its creation in 1999 to its current state of attempted revival has been a journey through changing visions of horror itself. The series matured alongside its audience, moving from the relatively straightforward supernatural horror of the first game to the profound psychological depths of Silent Hill 2 and beyond. It demonstrated that games could tackle serious themes like mercy killing, sexual abuse, mental illness, and existential guilt without diminishing or trivializing these topics. It proved that players were hungry for horror that respected their intelligence and challenged them to think deeply about what they were experiencing rather than just reacting to jump scares. The silence that surrounded the franchise for so many years after its decline was in some ways appropriate for a series about towns that exist outside normal reality and manifestations of trauma that refuse to be spoken about directly. During those years when Konami seemed to have abandoned the property, Silent Hill lived on in the memories and continuing discussions of its fans, in the countless games it influenced, and in the cultural impact it had made. The town may have been quiet, but it was never truly gone. Much like the traumas and guilt that the series explored continue affecting people long after the precipitating events have passed. As new projects promise to return players to Silent Hill or explore its themes in new contexts, the challenge will be whether they can understand what made the series special beyond surface-level aesthetics. Fog and rust and sirens are iconic elements, but they were never the source of Silent Hill's power. That power came from the willingness to explore uncomfortable psychological truths, to create horror that was meaningful rather than merely scary, and to trust audiences to engage deeply with ambiguous narratives. If new entries can capture the spirit while finding fresh ways to disturb and challenge players, then Silent Hill can live again not just as nostalgia, but as continuing artistic achievement. The story of Silent Hill is ultimately a story about how horror works and what it means. It is about how we create our own hells through our choices and our refusal to face truth. It is about how trauma reshapes reality and how guilt manifests in forms we cannot escape. It is about the power of atmosphere and suggestion, of what is implied rather than shown, of terror that burrows into the mind rather than assaulting the senses. It is about the artistic potential of video games and how interactivity can make horror more personal and powerful than passive media can achieve. It is about the communities that form around shared experiences of fear and fascination, analyzing and interpreting together, keeping the flame alive even in times of darkness. The foggy streets of Silent Hill await those brave or foolish enough to enter, their secrets never fully revealed, their horrors never entirely understood. The town serves as a reminder that we all carry darkness within us, that we all have personal demons we struggle against, and that confronting these demons is the only path to any kind of peace. Whether experienced through the original games, the films, or the new projects to come, Silent Hill continues to offer a journey into the heart of psychological horror, a journey that reveals as much about the person experiencing it as about the nightmares they encounter. The sirens may wail again, the rust may return, and new souls may find themselves walking those impossible streets, searching for something lost, running from something remembered, trapped in a town that exists everywhere and nowhere, inside the mind and outside reality, forever asking the question that defines the series. What are you afraid of, and what does that fear say about who you truly are?